Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, joined by co-host Erick Ybarra and also guest Vitalis Varaioun, who is a Russian Catholic church member. And I believe that you used to be part of the Eastern Orthodox Church, in fact, the Old Believers. Is that correct, Vitalis?
Yeah, I had kind of like not a long story, but like a medium-sized story, I guess. So yeah, I was Eastern Orthodox, and then I was an Old Believer for a few years.
Okay, so you went from Eastern Orthodoxy to the Old Believers. Which communion were you part of when you were Eastern Orthodox?
So, well, I was baptized Moscow Patriarchate, obviously. So I lived in Russia until 2003, and then I lived for 8 years in Canada. So when I was in Russia, I didn't really attend, but I guess technically I was a Moscow Patriarchate member. And then when I started attending church in Canada, it was OCA first, under Archbishop Seraphim. And then I switched to ROCOR after they entered communion with Moscow Patriarchate. I switched to ROCOR because I liked that parish better. And then from there, I became a Old Believer.
Now, if you could tell us what exactly are the Old Believers, what are some of the distinctives there, and why did you go from the Russian Moscow Patriarch to the Old Believers communion?
So, I mean, it could be answered in different ways because, again, it depends on which Old Believers. I guess we'll get into that as well because they have so many groups. But basically, like when I would tell English speakers, I didn't like back then to call myself an Old Believer. I thought it was too kind of strange. So I would just call myself like Orthodox, right? And like some old calendars, I would sometimes specify like True Orthodox, or Old Believers like to say Old Orthodox. So the reason why I switched was because basically I was a zealot, I guess you could call it that. So OCA, when I started my conversion, I began with authors like Floralgia, Schmemann, like you could say liberal authors, and then pretty fast I started becoming like a traditionalist Orthodox, you could say. I got interested in the old rite while I was still in OCA. So you could say my conversion is connected with old rite, old Russian rite, almost right away. And then, of course, OCA, I started saying stuff like OCA is modernist, Schmemann is a modernist, everyone is a modernist. So basically, ROCOR, of course, is more traditionalist, you could say, right? And also, as you probably know, ROCOR had an old rite bishop back then, Daniel of Erie, who presided over a parish in Pennsylvania, which is Old Rite Parish, Church of Christ the Savior, I think it's called. And then basically I became more and more traditionalist. So certain things started to bother me. And while I was in ROCOR, I should say I was Old Rite. So I was practicing at home the old Russian rite. And when I would attend ROCOR liturgy, obviously I would, switch, but I would cross myself with 2 fingers. I had the Old Believer prayer rope with me. I would prostrate on like a little pad that Old Believers use to kind of keep their hands clean. And then I would kind of interact with Old Believers on forums. At first, I thought I was going to be a priest and try to convert them, become an old rite ROCOR priest. But a friend of mine, basically, there came a discussion about differentiation between what we believe in and the rituals that we use. And I always maintain that, rituals are one thing, and then belief is something else. So you have like Western Rite Orthodox, you have like Old Rite under Moscow Patriarchate. So rituals are not that important. It's more about the faith. But he basically presented me with a quote from St. Basil. It's from De Spiritu Sancto, on the Holy Spirit. And there he talks about how do we know to believe in a Trinity that is like of one substance. And then he gives examples of baptism, that because we baptize in 3 immersions, 3 times, we know to believe in Trinity. Even if we didn't know all the other teachings, we know it through kind of rituals. And then kind of got me thinking, if you baptize incorrectly, let's say through 1 immersion, like Arians did, does it have a theological significance? And so kind of slowly but surely, that got me thinking that, Niconian, right, is heretical. And so I can't use a heretical rite because it confesses basically heretical teachings. So you asked about some specific kind of differences between old and new rite. If you talk about specifically regular old ritualists, so the ones that have priests, generally they don't differ in faith, from your regular Eastern Orthodox. There are, however, some differences, and again, I can go in more detail maybe later. I usually give an example of polemics against Catholics. There were kind of 2 parties, anti-Catholic parties, you could say. I call one party kind of extremist zealots, and the other ones are more reasonable. So the zealots would often, their arguments would differ from other Eastern Orthodox. So, for example, they would say, sorry for kind of what I'm going to say, but basically one of the things was that Catholics drink urine, right? Or they eat polluted animals. Or they step on crosses. That was there's a author, Nikitas Tesaros. He's a student of Saint Simeon, the new theologian, and among he had like a litany of things that is wrong with Catholics. So there was stepping on crosses. That Catholics in their churches, they have like crosses on the floor, and they would step on it, so it's blasphemous. Of course, the unleavened bread, etc. Right? So all believers are basically Orthodox of that ilk. So they would view those things as equally important as filioque or other theological issues. So if you kind of do a wrong thing, it has a theological significance. So if you use unleavened bread, that's a heresy. It's not just unleavened bread, So basically that was kind of my thinking. And then if you get into more extremist old believers, there are a whole bunch of differences. So I guess the typical ones, if you take into account priestless old believers, they believe the Antichrist has come. Mm-hmm. And contrary to the popular belief, they don't believe that Antichrist is a person. So Antichrist is the amalgamation of all the wrong things that are going on in the world. First and foremost in the Niconian Church. So they would believe that Niconian Church, Catholics, heretics, all together, that's what Antichrist is. Secondly, they believe that the priesthood has been basically canceled. I can, again, give more details later about why they believe that, but basically that priesthood is no more, that there's going to be a period of the struggle. So usually Eastern Orthodox and Catholics believe that the 3 and 5 years in Apocalypse is literal. They don't believe that. So it could be, many thousands of years before Christ comes. And then there are like a whole bunch of distinctions, like among priestess soul believers, but basically those are the main ones. So I was not a priestess soul believer, so I didn't really differ that much from Eastern Orthodox.
I have to ask, why do they say that Catholics, if I heard correctly, drink urine and eat polluted animals? What is that a reference to?
So the urine, it's actually, it's true insofar as in certain Western European countries, they did practice what you call urine therapy. It had nothing to do with Catholicism, of course, or nothing to do with what Catholic Church would teach. But again, practices are as much important to them as other things. So they would say Catholics drink urine. And polluted animals, it's actually something that Eastern Church generally believed. Of course, they don't believe that there is, kosher kind of deal. But because it says that we shouldn't eat blood or eat dead bodies, certain animals would be considered, because in the way they were caught, they would be considered polluted. So, for example, you can't eat rabbits because back in the day, they wouldn't catch them like with a bow and arrow. They would make I don't know what you call them in English, like a trap, right? Where the animal would die first, and only then they would take the body. So it essentially was a dead body, right? And then I guess later on, among Russians who didn't know about existence of certain animals that existed in Greece, fish first and foremost, like shellfish and stuff, Russians would also include those type of things. And I've had discussions with some old believers who actually believe that certain kosher rules were not abrogated. So they say basically all the laws that pertain to kind of being the shadow or foreshadowing for Christ, all of these are abandoned. Anything that doesn't have to do with that, it's kept. So, for example, I don't know, like shellfish, for example. Not eating shellfish has nothing to do with Christ coming. So if it was true back then, it's still true. Or like beards. So having a beard has nothing to do with Christ coming. So the Leviticus laws apply to Christians as well. So one shouldn't trim, cut, or do anything with their beards. So that's the short answer.
That's very interesting. So, I mean, how many people are we really talking about when you combine these different groups together? I'm sure it's hard to really estimate, but is there kind of an idea of how large these groups are?
So I've looked at some statistics. I'm sure like it's more, but it's around like 2 million, something like that. All the groups together, right? Mm-hmm. But it's kind of difficult because some people call themselves all believers, but they're not practicing. Because in Russia, it's a lot of like identity kind of thing. So I live in Northwest in St. Petersburg, and we have this republic close to here, Karelia, and a lot of people are all believer, like their roots are all believer, and when they do kind of like the statisticians, whatever, come to them and ask them questions, they would call themselves all believers, but they're not practicing. And then there's also a group of all believers who don't believe in doing what the government tells them. So they burn their passports, they don't use them. So but I mean, I guess that's not that significant because there's probably like just a few thousand of them, but still. And during the Tsar times, it was 1.5 million about that. But it was probably more because for a number of reasons. But so I give like 2 million estimate probably.
Which is the largest group?
So the largest group are, of course, the ones with priests, and they call themselves by hierarchies. So there are the two main hierarchies are Belokrinitskaya, which comes from the name of village, Belaya Krynica, which is now in Ukraine, but back in the day was Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then the second hierarchy is Novozybkovskaya, comes from the city Novozybkov in the central southern Russia. So those are the biggest ones, Belokrinitsky being the largest. And then from priestless all believers, Pomorian Church is the biggest one. It's the all believers who are less extremist, I would say, like they have married, they accept marriage. And that's the group that you have in North America. So the Pennsylvanian parish who became broker were Pomorians. You have them in New Jersey. There was a parish. There was a famous iconographer who lived in New Jersey. And then the people in Oregon, they have a few groups there, but Pomorians are also there.
Okay. And how did you end up going from the old believers to where you're currently at, the Russian Catholic Church? What exactly happened there?
All right. So, well, basically, there are a bunch of things. So first of all, generally, just I continued studying history and stuff like that. I was, like a teenager, then early 20s. I made a lot of rash decisions, kind of, I heard certain things and I would hate a group instantly, like, oh, did you hear Catholics did that? And I would say, well, Catholics are, a damned group, whatever. So it became clear to me, that kind of these extremist Byzantine people back in the day, like Nikita Stathatos and other people, there's another kind of way of thinking about it. So it's not that Catholics drink urine, it's more they have filioque and stuff like that, right? So I kind of became more, I guess I would support the other group more than the extremists at first. So that's my kind of first kind of shift. And then basically I interacted with a lot of kind of people who were more into kind of theoretical theology, which is not very big among Russian Orthodox back then, at least. So if you look at the history of Russian Orthodox Church, all the theologians came either early 18th century, and they were mostly Ukrainian. So they're technically ecumenical patriarchate. And then all the other ones which are famous, like Losky, Florensky, Florovsky, that's all, and of 19th century, early 20th century. So basically, theoretical theology is not something Russians are too big on, all believers included, right? So once I started interacting with just people who have this more, in my old point of view, scholastic way of thinking, they kind of introduced me to the differentiation that the Seventh Ecumenical Council had between the symbol, I would say the what it signifies and the method it signifies with, right? So it's not the symbol, it's what it refers to. And also just a bunch of historical facts, like I couldn't just get it all together. So for example, we know that people were not only immersed in the early church. So of course it was kind of like an extraordinary measure, because the main way to baptize was by immersion, by dunking or whatever you want to call it. But sick people would get like a wet blanket, they would wrap them 3 times in it, and if the person didn't die, that was baptism. So I was kind of questioning myself, well, is it valid or not valid? Because it can't be in between. Just because it's an extreme situation doesn't make it, any more real. So either it's a legitimate kind of way, I mean, it's not legitimate or illegitimate, is it a functioning method? So if you can wrap a person 3 times and he still be baptized, it means that it's not about the actual method. It's about either what the church prescribes how to do it, or it's the kind of intention, right, of what people are doing with it. So a typical example would be the history of sign of the cross. So as I said, all believers have this ritualistic differences. So one of the bigger ones, the central reason why they separated was the 2-finger sign of the cross, which looks like, let me use the right hand, like this. So you're using 2 fingers and 3 fingers. So the 2 fingers symbolize the natures of Christ, and 1 finger is a little lower than the other one. So the Godhead that came down on earth, or to earth, whatever. So that's the 2 fingers. The 3 fingers, of course, is the Trinity. And so in their thinking, you have to cross yourself with 2 natures of Christ, because that's who went up on the cross, not the Trinity. But we know through history that in the early church, one finger sign of the cross was used. So, and also there was no big sign of the cross. You read in Ephraim the Syrian, people would cross themselves separately, like their forehead, the lips, the arms, the chest, whatever. So people didn't cross themselves with a big stroke, right? So it's just a lot of smaller ones. Have you ever seen like old Greek women, when they yawn, they make like this quick sign of the cross over their mouth. So it's kind of more close to the ancient kind of thing. And so later on in 11th century, I believe, there was a new book released on how to accept different heretics into the Orthodox Church. And among many kind of rites, there was a one for Jacobites, so Miaphysites. And it says, "Whosoever does not cross himself with two fingers like Christ did, let him be anathema." Even though prior to that, right, they would cross themselves with one finger. So the question is why? Well, because the intention behind the one sign of the cross became different for this large group of people who were considered heretics, Jacobites. So this resulted in kind of solidifying of two finger sign of the cross instead of one. There's kind of interesting story, I'll mention it later, about two finger sign of the cross for the Niconians, who believed it was heretical, actually. So Christ crossed himself supposedly with three fingers, not with two fingers. So this kind of gave me a thinking, like that's the intention. And later, kind of, I started thinking more and more about that, and I kind of realized that I can't no longer say among the Bellicrines, all believers. Also, there was an issue of this period of time where they didn't have bishops. So I kind of really doubted in my heart that it was possible for a church to be abandoned like that. So for a church not to have bishops, even for some period of time. So I kind of abandoned all believers, and then I kind of shopped around, you could say. So while I was still in Canada, I tried to go to old calendarists. I was never really sympathetic to them, but it's kind of like too big of a jump from old believers right away to the evil Niconians. So I kind of, tried to like ease the transition. But then basically I kind of started not only to question the zealot Byzantine critics of Catholicism, but also I kind of thought, well, if there are a group of people that are wrong about this, maybe they're wrong about something else. And so kind of going over myself into kind of things I wasn't really interested in, like filioque and just pure theological issues, I started researching that. And basically, the longer I researched, the more it just, the Byzantine, the traditional Eastern Orthodox position was not doing it for me, basically. I don't want to sound too objective, right? But basically, it didn't convince me. And so I started studying kind of the Catholic position. Again, I approached it from very simple kind of, at first, of course. Now I'm, a genius of sorts. But back then I was a simple guy. So to me, what is the issue with filioque? Is the patriarchy of the father, right? Or monarchy of the father, sorry. So Catholics ruin the monarchy of the father, so that's why they're wrong. So then I started researching the Catholic position. Well, that's not really the case, right? And so things like that. And then all the other kind of issues, they didn't seem convinced. The Eastern Orthodox position didn't convince me, basically. And so also there were some other, of course, spiritual things, but, it's a reason in theology, not feelings in theology, so I'm not going to go into that. But yeah, so
fair enough.
yeah, so for those reasons, and at first I tried to kind of convince myself I was wrong. So like, it's not something I wanted. I don't want to be Catholic. I didn't want to be Catholic. Catholics they don't appeal to me in any shape or form. I don't like their liturgy. I don't like their spirituality. Like I would read, the basic stories like Francis of Assisi. Well, he's strange. And like Teresa of Avila, wasn't she just a crazy old woman? So, kind of like, I didn't want to be Catholic. And I try to kind of give reasons from an Eastern Orthodox point of view. But some of the things in my old believer background, which we can talk about in ecclesiology, is what definitely kind of did it for me. So I knew one of a stronger kind of positions Eastern Orthodox have are about ecclesiology. And because I was an old believer, I knew I couldn't like go with that. So I knew it was wrong, in my personal opinion. That's A, and B, Mary. So I had an old blog post about this. I mentioned my friend who is also an old believer and who also became Catholic. And we kind of became Catholics, not together, but like completely separate. He lives in Ukraine, I'm in Russia. So he told me before we kind of parted ways. So I said, I don't know what I'll be, but I'm definitely not an old believer. So I don't know what will become, but probably I'll be Eastern Orthodox because, Marian stuff is strange. And then how can I abandon Gregory Palamas, And then he told me that I don't know what I'll be either, but I'm definitely not going to be Eastern Orthodox because they blaspheme our Blessed Mother. And then I know what he was talking about, is that in old believer theology, Mary is immaculate. She wasn't immaculately conceived, perhaps, but it's what Father Kappas calls immaculate existence of Mary. So, and I knew that was true. And then after that, I went like, that's true. What is this? So like I started researching into contemporary Eastern Orthodox position on Mary. And I knew that was not what old believers believed. That's not what the Byzantine Church believed at the time of schism. I mean, Russian schism. At the very least, I have to have some assurance that Eastern Orthodox believe in the immaculate existence of Mary, and they didn't. Because all the kind of contemporary theologians, at least the ones I read, and answers from officials like bishops and the priests, they wouldn't believe in that. So they would say Mary was sinless, but she didn't have any special immaculate existence. So she just didn't sin by the fact that she was holy. God gave her a special grace, like God gives to some holy people, and she didn't sin. But to me, that wasn't convincing. I know, of course, that it's much more complicated than that, and you've discussed this on your show many times. But at the time, I'm just talking about what at the time I was going through, right? And then later on, I had to make the step of, trying to go to a Catholic church. At the time, I didn't know Byzantine Catholics existed. I knew the word uniate, which was a bad word. Like uniates are bad. So I went to our main church in St. Petersburg, Basilica of St. Catherine, which is, a Latin Rite Roman Catholic church. I attended a regular Novus Ordo mass, and I was like, well, that's not so bad. I thought they were going to they were all like convulsing and like going to ecstatic visions, and then, doing some strange things and kissing like Pope's, shoes or whatever. So I saw that, that's not the case. I started going to catechesis, and then, basically nothing stopped me then from going. Like, I realized I can't hold the contemporary Eastern Orthodox position. Catholics their position seems, I believed in it, right? Of course, a lot of it came after my conversion. Deeper research into filioque and other things, but at the time it was convincing enough, so I kind of switched. But I guess the main reason, which we can discuss, but maybe you have other questions about, the ecclesiology. So I knew it has to be papal primacy, and actually a lot of people, I hear a lot of people say like, well, I'm fine with primacy per se, but the fact that the Pope cannot err in dogma or morals, that's a little too much. But to me, that was the selling point. Primacy, that's actually, to me, that was more kind of shaky. But the fact that he can't err in morals and theology and dogma, to me, that was the selling point. I thought, like, well, it's either what all believers say or what the Catholics say about, their version of primacy. And so basically that was it for me.
Yeah, and I do want to ask more about the ecclesiology, but let me pass it over to Erick for a moment here and give him a chance to jump in.
Yeah, Vitalis, thank you for coming on. I've been looking forward to this. We've had our conversations on Facebook, so it's pleasant to have you face to face through social media here.
My honor.
Did you ever have a time in Protestantism? I don't remember exactly if that happened, but I recall you saying something. You looked into the Protestant theology, or was it just a matter of interest?
Yeah, I'm very interested in religion in general. Like my BA was in religious studies, so like I read a lot about Islam. So I often joke to my friends who are Catholic, I'm like, I think if I convert to something else, so it's more likely it's going to be Islam than anything else, but it's a joke, of course. So Protestantism, it wasn't something I looked into. To me, the issue of tradition was always obvious. I don't want to minimize, of course, Protestant position, but as I say, just from a personal point of view, to me, the whole thing about tradition was pretty obvious. Of course, after I researched, and it didn't become so obvious, but still, to me, Protestantism was interesting. Calvinism, I would say, was interesting because I looked into debates about predestination. There was one kind of thing with all believers. They really are big on Maximus the Confessor. And I remember a friend of mine sent me a quote that a guard in the prison asked Maximus the Confessor. He asked him, basically, he says, "How are you doing?" And he says, "I am doing how God predestined me to be doing." And it was kind of very interesting. So that's what kind of sparked my interest in Calvinism specifically. But I'd never really considered Protestantism as like an option for myself.
Yeah. Okay. So you've not been into the in terms of being a member into the Protestant church, but you did look into the theology, which is good.
Yeah.
It's good to study around, and I'm actually impressed that you're studying Islam because it's well worth the time. In fact, we should study whatever we can. A lot of people, after a number of years being a Catholic or an Orthodox, they'll run into a very intelligent, well-informed Muslim, and it could possibly rock their world a little bit if they're not informed. And sometimes there's some sort of deservedness of respect in Muslim theology, because whenever we get into this idea of just rejecting something altogether, I think that's when we start to become either ignorant willfully or we become dishonest.
Yeah, so, let me just say, like when I said I was shopping around, I remember on a forum with a friend, not a friend, but a buddy of mine, I even said, like, well, what about Oriental Orthodox? Because I looked into that as well. So I didn't think like, well, they're wrong just because they're wrong. It's obvious they're wrong, right? So I try to abandon that kind of thinking entirely. No one is wrong just because, I feel that way. So I researched into Severus of Antioch. I wouldn't say like I researched very thoroughly and very deeply, but I've researched enough kind of think about the decision. Like, is it a reasonable position to hold? And as much as I actually liked some of the theology, I couldn't hold it myself. So even Oriental Orthodox, I would say even Judaism, funny enough, I looked into. There were some doubts about, the Isaiah prophecy about the virgin shall conceive and stuff like that. So I'm really kind of, I think we talked about this on Facebook, that I'm kind of really bothered by people when they research and they become kind of infatuated with a certain position, they kind of don't look into other things like, well, if you like the Byzantine kind of position, well, did you research the Oriental position? Oh, no, that's kind of baloney. But why is it baloney? A lot of people kind of hold that position. Some people suffered for that position, and why is it just by default wrong? So yeah, I agree that people don't study enough. Of course, it shouldn't like trample, all over your position. But as you said, people get in contact with someone very educated, they rock their world, and I know people who became atheists as a result. So
yeah, that's and I think I forgot who I heard it from recently. I think it was a quote by, I know it was an Orthodox monk, but he basically, the gist of it was, if you're a slave to the passions, don't enter into theological discourse, because you always have to be humble, even not to the point where you're ready to just dispense with your convictions at the first sight of a contradiction, but you have to be humble in the sense, well, let's listen and understand.
mm-hmm.
And that takes a slow approach, instead of this is all wrong. And one of the examples I give is something we see here in America. Last year, I think when we started Reason in Theology, I had predicted that there was going to be a big exodus of people leaving Catholicism for Eastern Orthodoxy.
Mm-hmm.
And I was right about that, because, back in the 60s and the 70s, we had, this goes back to the 1920s. We were having Anglicans come in to the Catholic Church because of the Lambeth Conference, the contraception issue, and then eventually, decades later, with women's ordination, you saw a lot of Anglicans going into the Catholic Church. But then Vatican II happened, so then you had a lot of Anglicans that were like, "Whoa, let me stop here," and then they were going to Eastern Orthodoxy. So you have a lot of Anglican converts from the 70s, 80s, and the early 90s to the Orthodox Church. But it seems as though a lot of converts to Catholicism think that if Catholicism is wrong, then automatically, Byzantine Orthodox Church is true.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pattern I see. It's almost like a mathematical formula for them, because they don't see any other historical apostolic church. Now, that's if you live in the States, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it's probably the case in some other continents. But if you go to the Middle East, that's not the case, because you have the Oriental Orthodox, you have the Armenians, you have the old Persian Church, now the Syrian Church of the Syrian Apostolic Church of the East. You have these other groups, and they're not all mindless people. These are people who are well informed about the debate. We actually have a Syriac Orthodox member of Reason in Theology, Subdeacon Daniel Kakish. And I've known him for years, and he's always kept my toes to the fire.
Actually, I remember when I was researching infant baptism, the first thing I read actually was Pope Shenouda's little, I think it was a book, but it's like a huge article basically about infant baptism. So thanks to Pope Shenouda, I believe in the legitimacy of infant baptism.
Yeah. Well, that's, the when it comes to the issue of primacy too, the Oriental Orthodox have a historical case as well, because even back in the beginning of the Middle Ages, Rome acknowledged a very big Alexandrine primacy, the primacy of the chair of Saint Mark. Which it was Mark, the chair of St. Peter, but it was the chair of St. Mark, Peter's disciple. And so, that's one of the major Christian centers besides Rome and Carthage that started to take on the word Pope in English. And, and so that it was a big major center. So they actually have a slightly different understanding of primacy than I would say certainly of the Eastern Orthodox patriarchs, at least what they said in the 19th century in the famous encyclical of 1848, which to me it's just all the apostles were equal across the board.
Yeah.
Peter has a sort of preeminence, but it's really it's just an equilibrium down the line, and Rome got certain privileges in the 4th century at the Council of Sardica, but the church gave Rome those privileges, and then it was just over the West, as Zonaras, if I'm pronouncing it right, Byzantine canonists said in many centuries later. So the Oriental Orthodox, in my opinion, probably have a better case when it comes to a patristic defense of the early primacy of the churches.
And let me just say, actually, interestingly enough, I would say one of the, I wouldn't say biggest scholar, but I guess the most prominent scholar of Oriental Christianity in Russia is an old believer. Alexei Muravyov, he's a pretty big scholar. He's even known internationally. And he's really kind of like, I guess, I don't want to speculate on his kind of ecclesiological position, but it's more about like sticking to kind of your tradition. And I would say it's interesting that all believers have a lot of interest in Oriental Orthodoxy because, as I mentioned, two-finger sign of the cross, it was the original version of the sign of the cross that Assyrian church used. And the Niconian reformers would have referred to all believers as Nestorian heretics because of that. So there's kind of like a lot of, not love, I wouldn't say, but like interest in Oriental Orthodox.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, I was talking to somebody yesterday over the phone. They had called me, and we were talking about, you know, the church fathers and Rome and all these things. And one of the things that I picked up from the initial part of the interview here, and another thing that we were talking about last night with my colleague, was that the church fathers and the theologians of the past, they tended to be far more dogmatic about things, and in the sense of if you just had a Floralgia, you know, of church fathers citations, and for the listeners, Floralgia is an old ancient method of trying to prove your case about something from the church fathers. So like at the 7 ecumenical councils, a Floralgium of the church fathers on the Trinity would be given in order to prove that Christ had two natures. And that was sufficient at certain councils. But I think when scholarship turned into the more higher critical mode, the method of Floralgia is sort of not looked upon with a lot of strength anymore, because it doesn't have context and what the original author meant. And you need to put that citation back into the whole work of the original father. And so I think with higher critical research, it has sort of beefed up the scholarship in the different camps, like the Oriental Orthodox, the Roman Catholics. I think the Roman Catholics tend to be a lot more friendly, but that's just me. I think maybe too friendly on that score.
Well, yeah, because they're ecumenist heretics. Of course they are.
Right. But I think that Floralgia, that methodology, it's still good. Today they call it in the street quote mining, you know.
Yeah.
And not many people respect that anymore, unfortunately, because St. John of Damascus really liked it, you know.
Yeah, I'm reading right now. I'm reading Anastasius of Sinai. I'm not sure the English name. I guess it's called The Guide. It's his biggest Christological work, and I love those. I don't love them for like the fact, but it's pretty funny to read. He's like, and this father shuts you up, and then this father, you idiot, says this. Can't you read? And you know, stuff like that. And then he gives a whole litany of just quoting fathers that kind of support his position. And then I remember reading. Like there's a work published by Brill on early debates with Muslims, and they have like Nestorian authors or Assyrian authors, Miaphysite authors, and then Byzantine authors, and they all like kind of poke kind of the other positions, like, well, and those idiots in the Byzantine Empire, they say this, but it's not the case because, and then they give like a litany of quotes from the fathers that, that's wrong position or whatever.
Yeah, I don't want to be too unfair because guys like Saint Maximus the Confessor, Saint John of Damascus, and certainly as we got into the 10th and 11th century with the debate between Anselm of Havelberg and Nicetas of Nicomedia, they do recognize that we have to go back to the original intention of the author. So you can't just throw a bunch of church father quotes out. Yep. But at the same time, I think it may have been just the limitations on grammatical composition that they could, I mean, at the Council of Lateran 649, for example, where Maximus was highly influential on the diothelate position, it was all just Floralgia. Here's what the church fathers teach, and but at the same time, we know that Maximus did a lot of theology. So I guess what we could say today is that it's good that we have Floralgia. I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So I don't want to talk about it as quote mining. Oh, we don't do quote mining. No, you got to have the quote mines. You got to mine quotes. But at the same time, go to the corresponding context, the history, and the author to get the authorial intention and all that. I think that's important. So
let me just give an example of like Old Believers, because I would say that's the central method, right, that they use. It's collecting quotes. And why that kind of, not only because of the issues of authority, that's like a separate issue, but why that kind of fell apart is when I realized, that when I read, why that helped me kind of to not just automatically go Eastern Orthodox or go back to Eastern Orthodoxy, because I remember the debates between Old Believers and the Niconians, and actually the case that the Old Believers built was always stronger in terms of quotes. So the only thing that could break the quote kind of position was reasoning over the quotes, like, well, what does it mean? Like, what's the implication of that theologically? But Old Believers don't care about, generally don't believe about theological implication. They say, well, if it's written there, it has to be, right? So just because you don't like that position, spiritual antichrist is one position. They give like, well, give us the fathers that talk about, literal antichrist. And then, of course, they would give some quotes, but then Old Believers bring like Hippolytus of Rome. Of course, now we would think probably it's pseudo-Hippolytus, but still, who talks about it? Or Ephraim the Syrian, word on Antichrist, or sermon on Antichrist, whatever. They all kind of are closer to some Old Believer positions. And then secondly is when I realized Old Believers are very big on books that were printed until a certain period of time. Because later on, the books of Greeks were printed in Venice. So in Russia, they were under suspicion, maybe because Catholics would insert like wrong things. So they really relied on early printed books, on early versions. So generally it was Chrysostom, Cyril of Alexandria, and usually they weren't full works, they were compilations. So we have books called Chrysostom, and it's a compilation of Chrysostom from different sources on a certain issue. Or then they had what you call the Book of Cyril. Book of Cyril, that's Cyril of Alexandria, and then different parts and bits from him. Or also, John of Damascus was actually published fully. The book is called Skies, and that's his the the first part of the exposition of the Orthodox faith, and before that, that's the philosophical part. I forget what it's called. But so the skies are the philosophical part, and it's the exposition of the Orthodox faith, and then the list of heresies, whatever. And I kind of started like thinking, well, where is Augustine or whatever? Where is I knew certain Latin authors that I knew were quoted, like Pope Gregory, Pope Leo, because in certain parts they were quoted. But I was like, where's the work? Where can I read the entire work? And then when you read later Old Believer kind of debates with Niconians, they really go into like Augustine. Augustine is a huge kind of authority among all believers.
Wow.
And they would even call him Saint Augustine because they would quote, I forget which council, I think it was the Fourth Council, maybe, Ecumenical Council. They list the teachers of the church, and they list Ambrose, Augustine, Hilary, I think, of Poitiers. I'm not sure, but like I was kind of like, well, why am I forming a position, through amalgamation of quotes about a certain issue if I don't have at my disposal a lot of the Latin authors? So why would I think, if I believe in consensus patrum, how can I think it's consensus if I don't know the position of the other fathers, right? So what I said about all believers kind of helping me is that whenever Eastern Orthodox would act like an all believer, I would say like, oh, that's wrong, because I know where that thinking kind of leads. Because if you kind of develop that thought more radically, it becomes illogical. Of course, you can develop any thought to like it's ridiculous. Like you can take papal primacy and then take it into an extreme. Of course, you can do that. But when you kind of look at just regular positions, I realize you can't really do that. You can't just say, well, Saint Basil says, because then I'll go, well, Saint Augustine says, and
right.
like it's going to be battle of quotes. So it kind of also helped me to, realize there should be some, like something over quoting. But at the same time, as a former old believer, I have a very great love for researching in the fathers. And I kind of can compare it to Protestants who love the scripture so much that they know it so much better oftentimes than Catholics and Orthodox, to our shame, because they can get you a whole bunch of quotes. And we oftentimes can't, not because we don't want to, because we don't know the scripture well enough. We can't just grab quotes from there. So I respect all believers in that they can actually, from the top of their head, you say something, they go, oh, well, Saint so-and-so said this, because they love the fathers so much. And there's even, there was kind of like you could call it like a hierarchy, right? There was people called nachotniks, who are basically readers. So it's the apologists of the all believer position who their sole job was to just sit at home and read books. And they would read all kinds of fathers. Anything that new was published, they would read it all. So like that's why all believers surprisingly would quote like St. Augustine like extensively before the missionaries from the Russian Orthodox Church even got to reading him, because they were more busy with other stuff. All believers were, well, did you know St. Augustine says this and that and that? And then oftentimes the missionaries would go like, well, who cares about St. Augustine? He's like not really a saint. And all believers would go like, well, this council says he's a saint, stuff like that.
That's interesting. I really appreciate that balance, because I think what we have today is a shift to one side or the other. So you have people who shift just to the method of Floralgia, of quote mining. And then you have people who then they get so sick and tired of Floralgia, they go to theoretical philosophy and theology and coherence theory, and appeal to reason rather than appeal to authority. And there's got to be a balance, The problem, however, is there is a tension in what you said, the consensus patrum. For the listeners, consensus patrum means the consensus of the fathers. Certain theologians and church fathers of the past, and we see this come up at the Council of Florence, they did not believe that the church fathers could contradict each other. In fact, St. John of Damascus was famous for saying that it's impossible that they disagree. And so you have to work to stitch them together. And so St. John of Damascus was of that view. And so was Bessarion of Nicaea. And this is one of the reasons why, after the Latins had showed and of course, if we've got some people who are well versed on this, yes, there was some documents that were not reliable that were being pushed by the Latin side. Of course, it goes both ways. There was some on the Eastern side, but Varaioun said, "How can this be? How can we have church fathers like Basil, Gregory's, and the others teaching the monopatrist position? And then you've got Augustine, Leo, Hormisdas, Gregory the Great, all these guys teaching a procession from the Father and the Son." And so he thought, well, it's impossible that they contradict. And so that was one of the reasons why he was so compelled by the Latin argumentation. And but what we have found since Florence is that there are some occasions where it's really tough to reconcile the church fathers. And I think this goes all the way back to at least the monothelite controversy, because some of the Floralgia, there was competition. The Floralgia of Maximus, the Floralgia of Sergius, the Floralgia of the Pyrrhus of Constantinople. So you had my Floralgia beats up your Floralgia,
Mm-hmm.
and so you had some theologians at that time that were saying, well, when a church father is just speaking off the cuff or not, he's not really diving into it really dogmatically, then you might see mistakes. And then this really comes up in Photius, his mystagogy of the Holy Spirit, where he was recognizing, okay, fine, maybe Augustine, Ambrose, and even Cyril of Alexandria may have talked about a double procession, as they like to call it then. But that's okay, because that's catching them in their weak moments. And so we sort of hide the nakedness of our fathers when they make mistakes like that. Not everybody was of that opinion, though, because the doctrine of the filioque, that's pretty big in Augustine. That's pretty big in Ambrose and Leo and Gregory the Great, and even all the way to Hadrian and Leo III in the 8th and 9th century. The West was filioquist. There's no way if buts about it. So this causes an issue with modern Orthodox studies, because they're going to want to deny that. In fact, I don't know if you know. I don't know if you know this one author here. It's Father Michael Ascool.
No.
Okay, well, this is a book. It's called "Once Delivered to the Saints," and he's an Orthodox theologian. He's a scholar. He's well educated and everything. But in this book, he argues that Saint Augustine, was incorrectly registered as a saint in the church. Yeah. Now, I don't know if Father Michael Ascool still holds to that position. I want to be fair. This was published in 2000, so we're talking 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But you have certain Orthodox that it has to, that basically the church fathers can't make a mistake, and I think that Catholic theologians have been more. It's been more of a comfortable shift in saying, well, some of the church fathers said things that may have been wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that does come across as like nails on a chalkboard for certain Orthodox hearers. But
well, because like, for example, you can have like a hierarchy of positions, even because, for example, all believers won't be able to accept that, because all believers have is the consensus of the fathers, because they don't have church authority. Or even the ones that have hierarchy, they don't appeal to their current church authority. So they don't believe bishops. They don't see bishops having the same kind of, I don't want to say nature, but like position as Eastern Orthodox give to their bishops, and certainly not what Catholics believe their bishops have. So they only appeal to consensus patrum. If you contradict that, they don't have anything. And then Orthodox have their certain, of course, they don't have the same kind of teaching, as Catholics, but they have more. And so they would appeal more to kind of, outside. They would be a little more comfortable outside of consensus quattrum, but not too much, right? And Catholics, I find, are more comfortable because consensus quattrum exists, appeal to magisterium, especially not infallible magisterium exists, and then there's a next level, and then the next level until you hit the infallibility of Pope. So you have kind of more, I guess, comfortability with disposing of, let's say, I guess in this issue, the fathers don't really hold the same position. Well, that's okay, because we can appeal to authoritative theologians. And then if we don't have their consensus, well, then we can appeal to maybe a bull that a pope gave 2 centuries ago, or, et cetera, until we hit this barrier. And actually, I would say that's what also helped me to transition to Catholic position, is that basically with the old believer position, I hit the wall right away, almost with any contradiction. Because their main method is what St. John, and in fact, that's what they quote usually, St. John of Damascus. They would quote whatever contradiction you think they have, they don't have. So let me show you. And then they give their kind of reading. It's
right.
kind of I would say it's very similar to, I don't want to criticize too much, of course, but I think it's very close to kind of the situation in the Protestant world. Whereby they don't realize they're reading something through their lenses and they can't help it. Whenever you read the Bible directly, you're interpreting it yourself and putting your interpretation. Of course, I realize it's not that simple, but in simplistic terms. And then Eastern Orthodox oftentimes are like that, but they just don't have the Bible. They have the fathers also. So they would treat it like that. So it's impossible that there is a contradiction because the Holy Spirit worked through them. So
right.
It's just our infallible minds. We have to read them closer and closer. But for a Catholic, it's pretty easy to say, well, I guess they were wrong. You take who was against Mary's Immaculate Conception? Well, St. Thomas of Aquinas, Bonaventure, Albert the Great. If I was Eastern Orthodox, I'll get, well, that's it. I guess Mary is not immaculate.
Right.
But there's just one level for Catholics. So at that time, maybe one person could say, well, I think that's a more safe position. Of course, now we know through a lot of, publishing of Scotus authors, and then just generally people who didn't hold that position. And then the second scholastic period in Spain, we know that wasn't really consensus of theologians, but it sure looks like it, right? But we can relax and I wouldn't jump right away into oh, well, then that means this, because that's what I had to do when I was an old believer.
Yeah.
Do we use condoms? Well, let's go and see what the fathers say. And then I can't find anything, obviously. So I have to kind of like a Muslim, derive the sunnah from the tradition of the prophet, and then kind of criticize and stuff like that. Then, of course, the problem comes well, what if someone says, well, that's not authoritative for me? How do we discover the corpus Areopagiticum was not kind of probably not Saint Dionysius, right? So because the Orientals kind of said, well, who is he? And why do we think he is Dionysius? I don't think he is that. And then the Byzantines, St. Maximus wrote a huge defense that, well, no, it is Dionysius, because otherwise they lose an authority. And if they lose an authority, they lose a whole bunch of quotes that they can use against the other position.
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah. Hey, Michael, welcome back. We haven't even gotten into the issue of primacy. So if you have any questions about primacy, go ahead.
Yeah, I do a couple questions, in fact, about several different things. But, to kind of dovetail with what y'all are discussing here, since some of my other questions are a little unrelatable, we'll just kind of continue in this line. When it comes to primacy, what exactly is the old believers' understanding of it on a local level? And also, is there an understanding on a universal level?
So, no, there is no primacy at all. So it's kind of, if you read, Erick referred to the famous kind of answer to by the Eastern Orthodox bishops to the, I forget which pope, but the letter that he sent, right? So they said, well, there's no such thing. So essentially, of course, all believer position, it's kind of like that, of course. So the highest is the Universal Council, of course, but they all realize universal councils are done, right? So whenever Greek author would say, like, well, the 8th ecumenical council, during which Saint Gregory Palamas was, etc., all believers will go, no 8th council, it's 7 councils, that's it, right? So of course that's the highest appeal, but they only see it as an extraordinary thing. So bishops together, like all the all believer bishops together, they don't form that automatically. It has to be some sort of ecumenical council, and then there are all believers actually who believe Catholics supposed to be part of that.
How would an I'm sorry,
go
didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead. Well, no, I was just going to say, how would a group of all believers be able to have an ecumenical council?
So they don't. That's the thing. So priests, all believers, as I said, believe it's done. We're waiting for Christ. Priests, the people who have priests, actually, I guess the most educated position, I would say. So it's certainly the position that all of them originally held. And then the Lacroniska hierarchy became more zealot, kind of. And then the other hierarchy that exists, it's much more kind of accepting of that position. So the position is that first there needs to be a Russian council at which Niconian heresy will be anathematized. So there is a different understanding of what Niconian position is, but certainly the major thing is lifting the blasphemies that they put on Russian and Universal Fathers by saying that two-finger sign of the cross is a heresy, because we know many saints cross themselves like that, right? Probably from, like, I don't know, different scholars estimate different times, but certainly like early Middle Ages, right? So first that has to happen. After that happens, there needs to be some kind of decision what to do with other churches, Eastern churches, like Greeks and stuff. So for example, one of the hierarchies is, I don't know about now, maybe it's stopped, but they had ongoing dialogue with old calendars, the Matthewites, the Matthewite group in Greece, True Orthodox Church of Greece. And then after that, what to do with Catholics, because Catholics were not anathematized on any commonly accepted universal council. So technically, a lot of them believe that Catholics technically are still part of the church because they haven't been anathematized. They haven't been cut off completely. The only reason why they don't accept Catholics through either mirror or through confession of faith is because they baptize incorrectly. So that's the only reason. So really, you have to have a whole bunch of councils first, and then you decide, right? So, but all believers by themselves, most, at least before, they didn't think it's possible for just all believers to get together and say, well, these people are heretics, let's go on, right? So, and that's why. So the only thing, as I said, they have is consensus patrum. So the only way to determine whatever position they want to hold is, what do fathers say? How many fathers say it? And then does the ecumenical council say anything? So first they would go to ecumenical councils, read the acts. Then if there's nothing, they would go to the fathers. So once one father holds something, no one else holds it, then, well, I guess that's the position. And if there is one father who is wrong and two fathers, or one father holds position A and then two fathers who hold position B, then it's the position B, because that's the two fathers against one father. So it's that kind of a deal.
You know, I'd imagine I would say the old believers would probably agree that at some point the Bishop of Rome was Orthodox, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so when he was Orthodox, did he have any kind of special role in the church, and how would that role be described, or was he just absolutely no different?
No, I would think again, it's pretty much like the standard pre-20th century or early 20th century Eastern Orthodox position or contemporary position of Muslim Patriarchate. That sure, he had some privileges, um, and of course Peter was the first among the apostles. There's no debate about that. It's pretty clear from the fathers that he is, and clearly the position that the Pope had has some connection with that. But it was not. I guess you could say it's not an ontological. It's not of ontological nature. It's just simply by virtue of the church got together and said, "Well, Rome, you have a lot of cool history. Well, you should have some kind of special position." But for example, when the book of Matthew, right? The Niconian missionaries would quote it. Actually, about Peter, the quote about Peter, "Thou art Peter." They would quote it not in defense of papal primacy, of course, but in defense of primacy of bishops. So they say Christ said this to Apostle Peter, but he really was saying it to all the bishops, right? And then all the bishops, that's why they have this authority, and hence you all believers are wrong because you didn't have bishops for 2 centuries, right? And then all believer would say, well, you're wrong because what Christ is talking about is purely faith. And then they quote the classical stuff, Chrysostom, etc., right? So, and actually that's their position, that they would hold both priestless all believers and the ones with priests. They would say, no, it's only faith. And the only thing that held the Pope back in the day to the church is the fact that he was Orthodox. Once he lost his Orthodoxy, he's no longer, has no functions at all. So that's their position. But of course, they are aware of Orthodox popes. They quote whatever is present in the old printed books, like, as I said, Leo the Great, Pope Gregory, Dialogus, those type of books.
I want to quickly shift gears, and then we're going to go to some chat questions here, unless Erick has some additional questions. But one other thing,
watching us.
Yeah, one thing that I was really curious about was, and forgive me if you already answered this, but I didn't hear it at least. How come you didn't go to the true Orthodox, like the Matthewites, or one of those groups? Instead of Rome, how come you didn't, just look to one of those first?
I didn't really look. Let me say this. To me, the old calendar's position, frankly, was stupid. I don't want to offend any old calendars, of course. Now, I don't think any position is stupid. But back in the day, with my old believer position, I remember we had. So I'm looking around. I'm trying to locate my the thing for the phone because it's it's gonna die soon. But I'll find it anyway. Their position was always so the calendar got switched. It's heretical, not because the calendar itself is heretical. At least more educated old calendars, that's what they say, but because it's connected with ecumenism, which is an arch heresy, etc. So it's kind of close to old believer position. It's not the thing itself, it's the intention behind it, right? That is heretical. So three fingers is not heretical per se, but every time you say in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit and cross yourself, you're kind of putting Trinity on the cross, right? So that kind of didn't make sense to me. We had an old calendarist in a Roper parish. He belonged to the Synod of Resistance, or he didn't really belong to them because it's kind of like with SSPX, because the members, technically, the laity are not members of priestly societies, right? So he was not a member technically, and Synod of Resistance would say you can go to regular Orthodox parishes if they had old calendar, and if the priest didn't explicitly teach some modernist stuff or like ecumenist stuff, right? So, and he was an Arab, or Canadian Arab at least. And I remember telling him, well, there's these old believers. They're kind of interesting. They talk about 2 fingers and all that stuff. He said, oh, that's all baloney. Who cares about that? The calendar, that's the issue. And I was always like, well, how does that make sense? Because the calendar seemed to me, at least, less controversial in that sense, because I knew the early church, the Minor Asia, celebrated Easter at a different time than Pope Victor, I believe, he kind of had a discussion with Asia Minor. They celebrated in their own way for a while, and then the Roman Church kind of imposed Julian calendar, you could say, on people who celebrated it differently. So to me, I knew that was kind of wrong. This all believer position is that nothing has been changed ever from the times of the apostles. However, there are some things that were not given by the apostles, or they were given by the apostles in a variety of ways. So it's for the church to kind of, give me a second. I need to find the
go ahead. Go ahead. We'll talk while you look for your charger. But
just give me 2 seconds.
And by the way,
discuss something very interesting.
Yeah, everyone go ahead and send your
you.
chat questions. I only see 3 right now, so go ahead and send whatever thoughts that you have or whatever questions for Vitaly. Go ahead and send them now.
I find this very enlightening because one of the videos we did on answering Eastern Orthodox objections, I had said that one of the reasons why I don't go Orthodox is because I do see some of the stronger arguments of the old calendarists, but not so much because of the calendar. I think it's got more to do with the fact that they are against ecumenism and they're against all these other things. But it's important to know that you've got these other groups like the old ritualists, the old believers, that you also have to contend with them. So it's not just a matter of one calendar versus another calendar. It's a whole slew of reforms that came in Russia and contest between Greeks and Russians. So it's not just one option that you're dealing with, and you've got to look at the apologetics on each side. So it gets really tough. And one thing I know I'm certainly not doing is jumping into another religion just like that. I've learned now that I'm a Catholic that I need to take my time and really, really research things, because what has happened to me personally is some of the problems that I have with the Catholic Church. I've become more merciful to the Catholic Church and some of the difficulties I have in light of my research of other alternatives. So anyway, Vitalis is back. So, no, that's okay. If we have any questions from the audience, I don't know if we have any. Michael.
Yeah, we do. I think you had something that you were going to pull up there, Vitalis?
No.
No, he was trying to get his charger, his phone charger.
Okay, I got you.
Let me just quickly finish about the what was I talking about even? Primacy, I think.
Yeah, and we're
about the two finger and all that stuff, right? So obviously
Oh no, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So obviously, as I said, they realized like the popes from back in the day, but they lose their primacy, and they were really, as I said, emphatic on the fact that it's not the bishops, right? So any bishop can fall, and when you get asked, well, can all bishops fall? Then that's the question that all believers will have, because if you believe that it's only faith, and then they quote Maximus the Confessor, who says, when he was kind of interrogated, he said, even if I'm the only Orthodox, I will not commune with the heretics. And then I remember a second thing, you were talking about the old calendars. They would say, like, priests and some believers will say, well, even if a right-believing Christian who's not a bishop will be confessing the faith, the church is alive. People with priests would say, well, bishops can lose their see for a certain period of time, kind of sine vacante kind of thing, but it won't be lost forever. So there will still be some bishops present. But generally, if you ask them how many people have to be confessing the faith, according to St. Maximus, at least one. So I kind of had an old blogspot post on that. Like, the only difference is Catholics can say who that one person might be if you hold that position, right? So it's the one who is given the keys, but according to all believers, generally it could be any person. And then going back to, the old calendars thing. So as I said, I didn't switch because the old calendars position seemed to be less reasonable, because sign of the cross, it's something we can say is traceable to the times of early apostolic times. There's no information about what that sign of the cross looked like, but at least we know it. And that's not the case with calendars. So if there is a difference of opinion between different apostles, it's a reasonable difference. So we can have that difference. If there is no difference, and it was held from that point from that time, it's impossible it would change. So the Niconian kind of position would be to prove to all believers things changed. And then they called like married bishops, classical stuff like married bishops, using the image of the Agnus, the lamb, because the Sixth Ecumenical Council, or the Eastern Orthodox Sixth Ecumenical Council, banned depicting Christ as a lamb, etc. And then all believers would show either one of the two things. Either it's not an apostolic tradition that was abrogated, or it was given by the apostles to kind of the freedom of the church, and then the church is to decide what to do with kind of which position to hold. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to a couple chat questions. This one you kind of touched on already, but if you could maybe elaborate a little bit further on. What were the main arguments that convinced you of the validity of the papacy as opposed to Eastern Orthodox counter arguments?
Mm-hmm. So basically, as I touched on it, the kind of exegesis of Matthew, just the all believer kind of position certainly was traditional according to Eastern standards. Like, I can find authors right now who thought it was faith. Of course, you can find other quotes, but the big authors like Chrysostom, of course, when he comments on John, the words of Christ to Peter, he says a little bit something else, very Catholic, but in Matthew specifically, he says it's faith and only faith. So then when I would hear counter arguments from Eastern Orthodox, they sounded a lot like Catholic arguments. So it was always, if Christ is talking about not only faith, but also faith which is held by people who continue the apostolic succession by the bishops, then it kind of follows. And also, of course, you don't have to follow it, but in my kind of, if I develop it logically, and then I just focus on what Christ actually says, thou art Peter, it's talking about only Peter, I have to, because all believers tended to kind of look at the quotes literally. Like, they wouldn't, unless the father is using allegorical, they would use allegorical. But generally, if you see like thou art Peter, it's Peter, right? So that's one. Secondly, as I said, all believers are very big on quotes. So like, you get like 50 quotes against the other position, you're right, they're wrong. And whenever I would look at how the missionaries, the Niconian missionaries, would argue with all believers, they were basically like arguing with Catholics. Whenever they would argue with Catholics, they would become all believers all of a sudden. So like, they would just, quotes and quotes. And then like, whenever Catholic position would hold something else, they would either call them scholastics or to involve with reason, or Augustine is not really an authority. Well, Ambrose, what does he know? Hilary, we didn't know, etc. Right? So to me, it kind of was, if all believer position is wrong, the missionary, the Niconian, the standard Eastern Orthodox position kind of doesn't seem going further enough, because I know what the counter argument, all believer counter arguments are. And I've seen this many times in like forums and in discussions with Eastern Orthodox. like basically I can go into that discussion and say, well, let me tell you what all believers say about this, and give you a whole bunch of authority into positions you don't want to hold, right? So, like, let me give you some quotes about Mary's immaculate existence, and then I open like the service to her to Theotokos nativity, a whole bunch of things. Like, it's clear that the author is not talking about the fact that she freed us from the yoke of Eve and Adam by giving birth to Christ. It's clear that it's talking about her nativity, that the fact that she was born frees us from the yoke of or stain of Adam and Eve, and all believers really like held on to that, right? So my point is that for any number of quotes that Eastern Orthodox gives against Catholics, I can give equal number of quotes against the Eastern Orthodox position, number one. And number two, the ecclesiology didn't really hold for me, because either you have to be like ecumenical patriarchate, so acknowledge there's primacy and all that stuff. But I think Erick mentioned it in one of the programs, is that I knew that's not the position that we held from this year to this year. So I knew once the whole Photian schism started, and then other schism, and then the Great Schism, I knew that's not the Eastern Orthodox position. They did not believe in primacy. I mean, maybe you can find some authors who will refer to primacy. For example, All Believers, one of the authoritative books, it's called Book on Faith, it's called. It was published in Against the Unions in Polish Commonwealth, and the Ukrainian church there, well, it wasn't Ukrainian back then, but it was part of ecumenical patriarchy. So it actually has excerpts which talk about primacy of Constantinople, because it's the Second Rome, right? All believers say, well, Second Rome fell because of the Nicaean heresy. Third Rome is Moscow, right? And actually, it's very interesting. People generally don't know this side of history, what was going on in Russia, and how Russia was so important to a lot of Eastern Orthodox, that hierarchs from Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople would come to Moscow, because it was basically the only Orthodox government, the only Orthodox monarchy that had a lot of power. Basically, the Third Rome position actually came from not only Russian authors, but also from Eastern Oriental authors, Oriental meaning Greek and stuff, because they wanted to kind of show, well, Russia, you're the last kind of Roman power. So, but anyway, in short, I'm saying that basically, all believer position really opens up those problems in Eastern Orthodox, contemporary Eastern Orthodox theology. And so, to me, all believers were always basically the authentic old position of Eastern Orthodox Church. At the time of Florentine Union, at the time of Photian Schism, at the time of Great Schism, then that's the position I should hold, not the position that was later arrived by certain theologians. So that's why at least primacy was pretty obvious to me. I can't hold the contemporary Eastern Orthodox position. Of course, we know Moscow Patriarchate holds a little bit of different position, but that was also an argument for me, because I was like, well, if we don't know this essential structure of the church, and there's such a difference of opinion, well, how can I know what the true church is? Because I can't arrive at my own thinking. Just because I read a lot of books doesn't mean I can know with my thinking the truth. And also, if I can't appeal to hierarchs because they don't know, right? Moscow says this, Constantinople says this, they don't know what is the correct interpretation of primacy. So then my kind of thinking was, well, there must be some visible kind of sign or some visible thing that will tell me this is the church. Mm-hmm. And also the thing is, whenever I would read contemporary authors, Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, it's very, let me say, like not scholastic, but scholarly. Like there's a lot of research, and then there's a lot of like intellectual stuff. And to me, I always, as an old believer, it's like, well, that's not the kind of the salt of the earth are all Christians, not just these intellectual types. So I, as a simple person, as an old woman in some village, I should have some assurance what I know truth to be. Of course, you can say God doesn't hold an old woman accountable, but what if I want to know, right? So who do I appeal to? The hierarchs, well, they don't agree. Do I appeal to books? Well, what if I can't read? So there must be something. So kind of, as I repeated already several times, just because of the old believer position, Eastern Orthodox position didn't seem strong to me.
Oh, this one is from Mark. Is the Russian Old Rite celebrated by the Russian Greek Catholic Church anywhere?
All right, so I came across this kind of rumor many times. I don't know who started it. That the fact that right now there is some celebration. So historically, the Russian Catholic Church of Byzantine Rite. So by the way, it was never called Greek Catholic Church. That's not the name. Some parishes right now who kind of believe that they're descended from the original exarchates, or who just want to be part of Russian Catholic. Some of them have the Greek Catholic in their parish name, but the original name is Russian Catholic Church of Byzantine Rite. So originally the church had two rites, old and new. So among the first converts were old believers. So there was one priest who unfortunately was not a very good person. Or maybe in the beginning he was, but he kind of ended up basically being Judas. He worked with first the authorities of Bolsheviks and basically helped to eliminate the Russian Catholic parish. But his parishioners were actual old believers. And then there's also a martyr who is, I think, servant of God right now. But in the Eastern Byzantine tradition, there's no servant of God or not. So he's like we would say like a holy martyr, right? So the priest would. And so they were Russian Old Rite communities. But basically what happened is the Bolshevik Revolution, most people were killed. And then the way Russian church survived essentially is abroad. So there was two exarchates, one in Manchuria, in China, and that's the parishes that are right now exist in Australia. They derived their history from that exarchate. And then there was also a Russian exarchate that was first in France, I believe, and then in Rome, and that's the most Russian Catholic parishes, like St. Michael's in New York, etc. So the people who went abroad, there were no old believers among them. So basically, we haven't had an old rite service for like a century, basically, right? And personally, like I don't practice old rite anymore, at least not in any meaningful sense. I mean, I hold on to a lot of traditions. Like obviously, I don't cut my beard. I don't think it's some kind of important thing, but it's just what I like. Sometimes I cross myself with two fingers. So usually when I, say like Jesus prayer or anything referring to Christ, I cross myself with two fingers. If I say the Trinity with three fingers. But it's, so in short, yeah, so no old rite services anywhere in Russian Catholic Church or in other Catholic churches, I believe.
This one is from Hold the Tradition. Will Vitalis continue the Russian Catholic Insider channel? Recommended reading for those interested in Russian Catholic Church.
So just a second, sorry.
Sure.
I have an English class right after.
Yeah, no problem. Not a problem.
Sorry.
No problem at all. And if you need to wrap it up, that's fine. Let me know if you're limited on time with questions, because I see a few more.
I have like 15-ish minutes, okay. I think.
Yeah, so we should be able to get to them.
All right. So What were you talking about? Sorry.
Well, this one is a question from Hold the Tradition about continuing the Russian
channel,
Catholic
right.
Yeah.
So I think one person asked me from Italy, he private messaged me. We started that channel with another parishioner from our parish. He's finishing his MA, and then we don't know now with coronavirus. He was supposed to go to seminary. And so he's kind of busy, and alone it's kind of the cameras and all that, it's kind of difficult for me. So I didn't want to have recorded on the phone, whatever. And also I didn't think people were that much interested. Of course I had some comments in there, but I thought who cares about that? So I started the blog post. So if anyone is interested, it's RosaniaCatholica.blogspot.com. Rosania Catholica being the old name for the church, the Greek Catholic Church in the territory of Russian Empire. So it included the future the Ukrainian Catholics, Belarusian Catholics, and Russian Catholics. It was called Rosania Catholica Unita, which means Union Russian Catholic Church. So I'll probably continue the blog post. I haven't been posting there either. Because I'm translating most of the stuff from English to Russian. There's nothing available in Russian, or very little. So before I die, I want to give as much as possible to the Russians first, and then maybe inform on some cool stuff about believers or whatever to Americans who are interested.
Excellent. All right. Well, here we go. This one is from Christopher. Could you speak to the indefectibility of the Catholic Church in our current state of Vatican II, as it seems there are two issues that cause apostasy for the faith?
So, well, it depends. I guess you guys can interpret it for me about the indefectibility on what exactly the person is referring to. As for Vatican II and the current state, so I don't like to say I'm on this camp or that camp. I don't like camps, whatever. And also a lot of kind of, let's call it SSPX leading kind of positions are not appealing to me because, I want to be politically correct, not say anything too bad, but basically it's just, as a former person who was in fact, technically at least a schism. Of course, I don't want to call any Eastern Orthodox schismatic. I just technically, from ecclesiological point of view. So it's never really I was never really tempted at all. Because maybe it's also my personality. I'm very rational, I guess. So whenever I see some bad stuff, I have totally separate my feelings about it and my thoughts about it. My feelings are, I think, all Orthodox Catholics, they don't like what's going on. But my feelings and actually the reality is something different, because I know there are Orthodox bishops. I know the position, the actual position about infallibility. I find that a lot of Catholics who are tempted by going Eastern Orthodox or whatever, or going somewhere else, don't really understand the Catholic position on infallibility. They don't understand the nuances, which I came to know. So I haven't seen anything really that kind of shook my belief in that. Maybe the closest thing that came to it was what Pope said during the Abu Dhabi, what are you going to call it, conference, or what is it, meeting, whatever. That came a little bit close, but then again, it's a matter of interpretation of what he meant, which I have my thoughts on what he meant, but it's not I can't base any, I can't perform any actions based on what I think he meant. Plus, you have the Athanasius Schneider, who came up to him and asked him off the cuff, well, what did you mean? And he gave an orthodox, kind of more or less orthodox interpretation of what he meant. So, to me, kind of that's it was never an issue. However, talking about reforms, liturgical reforms and stuff like that, as an old believer, liturgical reforms are very big issue for me because Russian church was, just to give you an idea of how serious it was, the Nicolean hierarchy basically thought that anyone who uses old rite is not only just a schismatic because he doesn't listen to the hierarchy, he's a heretic. So he processed himself like the Nestorians, like the Macedonians, even, and other heretics. And there was a famous monastery in Russia, Solovetsky Monastery, where actually Blessed Leonid Fodorov, our martyr, first exarch, was martyred. Many people were martyred there. Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox bishops were martyred there later during the Bolsheviks. So it's a famous island. And basically the monks refused to accept the new rituals. So they barricaded the monastery and there was siege of the monastery. The authorities sent troops there and they would siege the island, because the monastery is on an island, for I think 5 years or something like that. Once the siege was, once when they were able to go into the monastery, they killed at least 600 people, 600 monks there. And the stuff that the Niconian authorities and the church hierarchy was doing to old believers is just unimaginable. So when I go and read what happened at Vatican II, it's kind of, I'm sorry, but I mean, it's serious in a sense, but it's not serious to that point in a sense. So my personal view, I don't like Novus Ordo. I don't like it. The history of how it came to be, I don't like it. I see a lot of problems with it, of course, but I can never come to a conclusion that it's heretical. And again, now I'm a firm believer in the fact that rite by itself cannot be heretical. Because if you're telling me by excluding certain words from the Mass, you abrogate the belief in real presence, well, buddy, I have news for you. You have to cross yourself with 2 fingers then, or with 1 finger, or whatever, because then what you're telling me, it's not the intention, it's the form itself, which is not correct. And I'm in no position to kind of theorize on what an individual priest believes in his head while he is doing the consecration. So, because then I can go insane and say, well, what if he's an atheist? So, is he doing what the church prescribes him to do or no? I don't know. But I know that Christ won't abandon his church. And I firmly believe it's the Catholic Church. So I don't really, it's not really a Novus Ordo bashing kind of session. So I'm not going to go into that. But basically, in short, I don't like the reforms, but canonically and otherwise, they're legitimate as much as I don't like them. And I really hope they will get rid of them, right? In terms of like theological stuff and Vatican II, again, it's kind of my old believer background. I know anything has to be interpreted. Whatever sounds heretical to you must be interpreted. And if 100 bishops give you heretical interpretation, I don't really care. Even if it's most bishops will give me heretical kind of interpretation, I don't really care, because what I care about is what the rock on which the Catholic Church stands. And even if this particular rock doesn't seem to be that great, I still believe Christ gives him the same things he gave to Peter. So that's my kind of all over the place answer.
Oh, that was good. There's one more. Hold the tradition as Vitalis read Vladimir Solovyov's Russian and the Universal Church.
Yeah, so my blog that I mentioned, it's called Russian and the Universal Church. So it was a big influence on me in terms of questioning certain, when I was kind of thought like, oh, just go to Russian Orthodox Church. I started reading Solovyov. I knew Solovyov all my life because he's one of the biggest Russian philosophers. And I thought he was really cool looking when I was a kid. I had like an encyclopedia with his picture with a beard and all that stuff. He's a cool guy. So I think an important thing he asks there in that book is, well, guys tell us about universality, right? So you're saying the church is universal all the time. And actually, the missionaries, the Niconian missionaries, would tell the old believers, well, don't you realize the church is universal, Catholic, etc.? Right? So it's an appeal that is realized, right? But then some of you ask, what about practice then? Where are the ecumenical councils? And of course, I don't want to, dance on, dead people or, dead bodies, whatever, but we have examples of recent attempts at something like an ecumenical council which fell through. Of course, you can say, well, it's just practical reasons it fell through, but it seems it's not just practical reasons. It seems to be like a real problem. So you can reply to that, of course, and then you can have different interpretations of what that means or how you can kind of, give an Eastern Orthodox answer. But personally, as I said, it was a huge question for me because I never thought about it. Because to me, ecumenical council is like the highest thing. What else can be higher? But then really, it's living voice of the Holy Spirit. I think in one of the ecumenical council says it's the trumpet of the Holy Spirit. So if we don't have any trumpets, right?
I think we may have lost you there. Vitalis, can you hear us? Yeah, I think he may have froze up on us or cut out or something. Erick, you're not still able to hear him, are you?
No, he froze up.
Okay, just making sure it's not on my end. We'll give him just another second here. I know he had to wrap things up on his end, and we do too. We have another stream going on with Sebastian Brock taking place too after this, if y'all want to take a look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess he might not be able to return.
That's okay. Yeah, I think we can cut it. Yeah.
Yeah, he dropped out. So
yeah. We'll have him on again.
Oh yeah, that would be great. I don't know. Did you get the spelling of the name of that blog? There was somebody asking for it. I wanted to try to get that clarified for the questioner. If not, what I could do is I could get it from him because Mike is asking. I could get it, the spelling of it, and I will put it in the description to the YouTube. So we'll get that for you. And then I see 101's Caliber's asking a question, but what you can do is just post that into the comment section, and I'll make sure Vitalis knows about it and responds to it. Sorry that we couldn't get to that there. Any comments you wanted to make, Erick?
No, we had a fantastic show. I really appreciate him coming on.
Oh yeah, that was excellent. I definitely want to have him on again. Somebody was saying he needs to come on and debate the issue of the Immaculate Conception.
Right.
Right. That'd be interesting. But anyways, everyone, thank you for watching. Please comment, like, subscribe, share this on your social media. Until next time.